In September 1959, a Soviet meteorological balloon in the Ural Ridge Corridor recorded wind at 0 velocity. Not calm, 0. The instrument detected pressure differential, detected directional orientation, detected all the preconditions for movement. And then no movement. The air had a direction and no speed. The air was arranged like wind and going nowhere. The meteorologists at Sverdlovsk Station filed a request for equipment review. The equipment was functioning. The reading was accurate. A second balloon, deployed the following day at the same coordinates, produced the same result. Directional pressure, 0 velocity, for 4 hours and 11 minutes before the reading normalized. 2 weeks later, a second anomalous reading appeared. Same corridor, different coordinates. Duration, 6 hours and 40 minutes. Then a third, then a fourth. Always in the same mountain corridor. Always 0 velocity paired with detectable pressure and direction. The readings that define wind without being wind. The station chief filed an alert with the Academy of Sciences. The Academy forwarded the alert to a division I cannot find in any published organizational chart for the period. The division responded within 48 hours, faster than Soviet institutional machinery moved under any normal circumstance, classifying the anomalous readings as instrument artifacts and closing the public record. The division then opened a separate record. That record is what I am reading now. In those days, Soviet scientists worked under constant surveillance. Every discovery, every anomaly, every piece of data was monitored by the state. Today, you have a choice. NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic and keeps your identity hidden from anyone trying to track what you do online. If you want to protect your privacy, check the link in the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. When I was 14 years old, an old man lived 2 floors above our apartment in a building on Gagarina Street in Sverdlovsk. His name was Gennady Ilyich. He had been a military meteorologist, he told anyone who asked, before his retirement, which was all he told anyone who asked. He was quiet and precise, and he kept his apartment the way a person keeps an organized mind. Everything in its place, nothing superfluous. He died when I was 17. He had no family. His neighbors were asked if they wanted anything from his belongings before clearance. My mother took a cardboard box because he had specifically asked her, once, to hold on to it. She put it in the storage space under the stairs. Then she moved. The box went to the attic. I found it 3 months ago while helping her clear the attic for a renovation. I remembered the box. I remembered that, when I was 15, I had opened it briefly and seen a single sheet of paper on top. A diagram, hand-drawn, concentric circles, with arrows pointing inward at every position on the outer ring, toward a central point with no label. The arrows did not exit the center. They pointed in and stopped. I had not understood what I was looking at and had closed the box. I understood it 3 months ago because I had spent the previous week reading the Wind 2 program file. The program's full designation was Vetrovoy 2, Wind 2, which implies a Vetrovoy 1 whose documentation I cannot locate. The founding records describe its objective as research into atmospheric pressure manipulation for strategic application, which is the language of a military program trying to sound like meteorological research. What the program was actually doing is described more plainly in the internal technical memoranda, written for an audience that did not need euphemisms. They were building a weapon that used air. Not a weapon that moved through air. A weapon that moved air, that shaped it. That arranged atmospheric pressure in specific geometric configurations which would then persist, static, oriented, waiting, in designated zones. The military applications are enumerated in the founding documents with the specificity of people who have already decided the applications are viable and are now designing the engineering. Restrict enemy aircraft flight corridors by creating zones of anomalous pressure that instruments would read as safe, but that aircraft could not navigate. Direct weather systems toward or away from strategic locations. Create persistent low-pressure zones over population centers that would produce specific physiological effects in the people living beneath them. That last application is the one I keep returning to. I spent 2 weeks before I read the program file trying to find what Section 14, the Ministry of Defense subdivision that oversaw Wind 2, had done before this program. It appears in the administrative records of 5 other classified projects across the 1950s and early 1960s, all of them involving phenomena at the boundary of physics, and something the documentation consistently refuses to name. Programs that produced findings their supervisors would not include in technical summaries. Programs that were terminated with language suggesting completion when the documentary record shows they had not completed anything. Section 14 kept appearing at the edges of things that official science could not accommodate, funding the observation of those things, and then classifying what it found at levels that prevented anyone from connecting one program's findings to another's. Wind 2 was one of these. It was also, based on what I have been reading for 3 weeks, the one that went furthest. The one that stopped being observation and became construction. The one that built something and left it standing. The program's chief physicist was Yevgeny Astakov, 44 years old, recruited from the Institute of Atmospheric Physics in Moscow. His working journals from the program's first phase are in the file. The documents of a brilliant and driven man who was also, as his journals make increasingly clear, someone who understood exactly what he was building and had made his peace with it years before I started reading his notes. His entry from March 14th, 1960, describes the breakthrough that made everything that followed possible.
We have achieved stable configuration. I want to document this precisely because the conditions that produced it have to be replicable, and I'm not certain I understand all of them well enough yet to guarantee replication. The configuration requires 2 transmission arrays operating at phase offset of exactly 37 degrees. Not approximately, exactly. Below 36.8, the configuration destabilizes within minutes. Above 37.2, the pressure geometry inverts, and you produce the opposite of the intended effect. At exactly 37 degrees, the pressure differential creates a self-reinforcing structure. The configuration holds itself without continued energy input once established. Think of it as a standing wave in water, except the medium is atmospheric pressure and the wave does not move. It stands. I held a stable configuration for 9 hours and 22 minutes today before deliberately collapsing it. This is not a marginal phenomenon. This is the technology. What we do with the technology is a question I am going to set aside for now, because the question of whether we can is still more interesting to me than the question of whether we should. I recognize that is a choice a physicist makes. I am making it.
He recognized it as a choice. He made it. And then he spent 4 more years refining the technology, and his journals across those years document the progression from experiment to application with the specific trajectory of a man who has convinced himself that the question of should is someone else's responsibility. The program's first full-scale field test was conducted on April 29, 1961. 2 transmission arrays positioned 40 kilometers apart in the Ural corridor, oriented to produce a stable pressure configuration over a test zone of approximately 12 square kilometers. The technical teams at each array communicated over a dedicated radio channel. The transmission log for that day is in the file. I want to read you the section from the 40-minute period when the configuration first held, because what the log records is not what I expected to find in a technical communication between 2 groups of engineers running an atmospheric physics experiment.
Array 1 to Array 2. Phase offset locked at 37. Configuration forming. Confirm your readings. Over. Array 2 to Array 1. Confirmed. Pressure geometry establishing at expected coordinates. Everything nominal. I want to note something about the channel quality. Over. Array 1. Go ahead. Over. Array 2. The channel is very clear. Clearer than it should be at this distance through the ridge. We are receiving you at close range quality. Over. Array 1. Confirmed on our end. We noted it when you first transmitted. Something is happening to signal propagation in the corridor. We are reading you as if you are 10 kilometers away instead of 40. Over. Array 2. Understood. Configuration is fully stable as of this transmission. Standing pressure established. Duration timer started. Over. Array 1. Are your personnel reporting anything anomalous? Over. Array 1. Checking. Yes. 2 of our team are reporting a change in... They are describing it as a change in the quality of the air. Not temperature, not pressure, in the sense they can feel it against their skin. Something else. One of them says it feels like the air has become attentive. Over. Array 2. We have the same report here. 4 personnel, same description. Attentive. I'm going to log this as a subjective anomaly and continue the test. The configuration is holding. Over. Array 1. Agreed. Continuing. Over.
Attentive. The air feels attentive. 2 groups of engineers, 40 kilometers apart, independently reporting that the air in the zone of their stable pressure configuration has acquired a quality they can only describe with a relational word. Not a physical word, not a measurement. A quality of presence. The specific presence of something that is paying attention. The program director's annotation on the transmission log reads,
Note subjective reports for medical follow-up. Do not include in technical summary.
The technical summary, which I have read, does not include them. Now, I need to tell you when this file broke open for me. I thought Win-2 was a weapons program that achieved its technical objective and was then abandoned. The usual trajectory of Soviet military science projects that succeeded at the physics and failed at the implementation. A standing pressure configuration is an interesting thing. Turning it into a deployable weapon is an engineering problem of a different order. I assumed the program ran into that problem and stopped. I was wrong. The program did not stop at the physics. The physics was the beginning. What the program spent its remaining years refining was not the configuration itself, but what the configuration carried. The air they were shaping was not the weapon. The air was the delivery mechanism. Here is the first contradiction. The public meteorological records for the Sverdlovsk region between 1959 and 1963, filed by the Civilian Station Network, published in the Standard Academy of Sciences Atmospheric Registry, show normal weather across the entire period. Standard seasonal variation, typical Ural pressure patterns, no anomalies. Any meteorologist reviewing the public record would see an unremarkable 4 years. The program's internal measurement archive, filed separately and requiring a higher access level, shows something entirely different over the same coordinates and the same dates. 18 stable pressure anomalies, each lasting between 4 and 22 hours, each centered on coordinates the civilian network was not instrumented to detect. Each one invisible to the public record, because it operated at pressure differentials too small for civilian instruments and too precise for natural formation. 18 invisible weather events in 4 years. Events that the people living beneath them could not have known were occurring. Events that the people running them could track to the meter. I know what coordinates some of those events were centered on. I know because the program's internal measurement archive includes a geographic index. I have been working through that index for 3 weeks, and the working has required me to stop several times and sit with what I was finding before I could continue. Before I tell you about the second contradiction, I need to tell you about an entry in Astakov's journal from October 1962, midway through the program's operational phase, because it is the moment when his understanding of what he had built began to change in a way his final entry 3 weeks after the termination order makes clear he never recovered from. His entry from October 9th, 1962 reads,
I have been reviewing the measurement data from configurations 1 through 6. The first 6 stable pressure structures we established, all now officially collapsed and recorded as terminated. I was reviewing them for calibration purposes, looking for residual drift in our instruments from previous deployments. What I found is not instrument drift. The sensors at Configuration 3's coordinates, established September 1960, collapsed October 1960, over 12 months ago, are still reading a signal, not the signal from the active configuration. Weaker, much weaker, but structured. The pressure geometry is still there in attenuated form, persisting below our standard detection threshold. I thought this was instrument artifact. I deployed a second sensor array. Same reading. I checked the mathematics. The mathematics says this is possible. A self-reinforcing standing wave in a sufficiently stable medium can maintain its structure indefinitely at diminishing energy levels. The same way, a very still pool of water will hold a standing wave for far longer than turbulent water would. I did not take this possibility seriously when I built the system, because I did not believe atmospheric pressure was a sufficiently stable medium. I was wrong. The air at those coordinates still holds the shape we gave it in 1960. I do not know what this means for the configurations we are currently running. I do not know what it means for the ones we have already terminated. I'm going to keep this finding to myself for now while I verify it further. I recognize that keeping a finding to myself is not how science is supposed to work. I'm doing it anyway while I decide what the finding means.
He kept it to himself. He verified it further. He spent another year building more configurations, knowing they would not dissipate when he collapsed them, and filed his reports with the program director who annotated them with expected and no further action required. And then 3 weeks after the termination order, he sat down and wrote his final entry and closed his journal and did not go back to his desk. The second contradiction is in the medical records. The program conducted 6 operational tests in populated areas between 1961 and 1963. These are described in the technical documentation as calibration surveys, which in context means we deployed the technology in places where people live to measure what it does to people living beneath it. Each calibration survey produced 2 reports. The technical report describes the atmospheric parameters, configuration, stability, duration, geographic spread. The medical report, filed separately at a higher classification level, describes the physiological responses of program personnel working within the affected zone. For the first operational test, October 14, 1961, the technical report records successful configuration at target coordinates, stable for 7 hours. The medical report records that 11 personnel within the 2-kilometer radius reported identical symptoms within 4 hours. A specific pressure sensation in the sinus and orbital cavities, not painful, described consistently as a feeling of presence, a heaviness behind the eyes, a sense that the air around them had become occupied. All symptoms resolved within 2 hours of the configuration being collapsed. No lasting effects documented. The air feels occupied. A presence in the air that was not there before. 11 people in a 2-kilometer radius, independently, using the same words. The medical reports for each subsequent calibration survey show the same symptom cluster. The intensity varied with the configuration parameters. The program was refining its ability to modulate the effect. But the quality was consistent across every test. In every person exposed, the air becomes occupied. Something is present that was not present before. Something the people beneath the configuration can feel without being able to describe in physical terms. The program also conducted 3 tests of a different kind, not over inhabited areas but over designated flight corridors. The goal was to test whether a stable configuration would affect aircraft navigation the way the founding documents had predicted. The results of those tests are summarized in the technical record without detail. The detail is in the pilot debriefs, which are filed in a separate subfolder at a classification level above the program's standard access tier. The debrief for the second corridor test, conducted in March 1963, was given by a major in the Soviet Air Force whose name appears only as a 3-letter designation in the document. His aircraft was a MiG-19, standard reconnaissance configuration. The debrief transcript reads, "The pilot's debrief was precise, methodical. He chose his words carefully.
I want to be clear that everything I'm reporting here, I'm reporting as a factual observation of conditions I encountered. I'm not speculating, and I'm not interpreting. I flew the corridor at assigned altitude, and the aircraft performed normally for the first 40 kilometers. At the coordinates you specified, I encountered a change in conditions. The instruments read nominal. Airspeed, altitude, heading, everything inside normal parameters. What was not inside normal parameters was the response of the aircraft to my inputs. The controls were working. The aircraft was responding. The nature of the response was wrong. When I banked left, the aircraft banked left. But it felt... There's no technical language for this, and I apologize. It felt like banking into something rather than through something. The air had resistance it should not have had. Not in the sense of unexpected wind shear, in the sense of presence. I have flown 1100 hours. I know what turbulence feels like, and I know what wind shear feels like, and I know what ice accumulation feels like. This was none of those things. The air felt like it had already decided where it was, and was not interested in being moved. I flew through the zone in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. For those 4 minutes and 20 seconds, I had the consistent sense that I was flying through a space that was occupied by something that was allowing me to pass. I exited the zone, and conditions normalized immediately and completely. I am filing this report because I was asked to report everything I experienced. I have reported everything I experienced.
The air felt like it had already decided where it was. A combat pilot with 1,100 hours of flight time, describing the stable pressure configuration in the same relational language that the ground personnel used: occupied, attentive, present, without having spoken to any of them, without having read any prior debrief. Simply encountering the thing the program had built and finding the same words everyone found when they stood inside it. The program director's annotation on the debrief:
accurate observation of expected aerodynamic effects. Parameters confirm successful test. No further action required.
Expected. He called it expected. The air that felt like it had decided where it was, that was the expected result. Wind 2 was formally closed by administrative order dated November 8, 1963. The closing memo cites resource reallocation and program objectives achieved. Astakov's working journal, the final volume, covering the program's last months, contains entries through November 29, 1963, 3 weeks after the termination order. He kept working for 3 weeks after the program officially ended. His entries in that period contain no further testing. They contain a series of calculations, working through the mathematics of what the program had built. Arriving at a conclusion, his earlier entries suggest he had been approaching for months and had been delaying writing down. His final entry, dated November 29th, is the only entry in 4 years of journals that contains no technical notation. It reads, the page ends there, the rest is silence. Astakov wrote one final entry in his journal.
I have finished the calculation. I have checked it 4 times. I want to write it here because I do not know where else to put it, and because not writing it feels like a specific kind of dishonesty I am no longer willing to practice. The configuration we built does not dissipate when collapsed. It attenuates. The pressure geometry becomes too weak to measure with our instruments, but the structure persists. I can demonstrate this mathematically, and I'm convinced the mathematics is correct. What we call the standing wave does not stop standing when we stop feeding it energy. It goes below our threshold of detection and continues. Every configuration we established in 4 years of this program is still there. Weaker, much weaker, but present and stable in the way that standing waves are stable, because stability is what they do. We built 18 of them. They are still there, over cities, over the corridor, over every coordinate in the geographic index. I do not know what they are carrying now. I know what we put in them. The question I cannot answer is whether what we put in them is still what is in them. or whether 4 years of standing in the air above inhabited places has changed what they contain. I do not know how to ask this question in the language of atmospheric physics. I'm writing it here and closing this journal, and I'm not going to work on this anymore.
The configurations are still there. 18 standing pressure structures below the threshold of standard instrumentation, built in the late 1950s and early 1960s, never collapsed, still present, by Astakov's mathematics, which I have had reviewed by a colleague who confirms it is correct. I need to tell you about the box. The sheet of paper on top of the box from Gennady Ilyitch's belongings. The diagram I have remembered for 20 years. I understand it now. The concentric circles are the pressure geometry of a stable configuration. The inward-pointing arrows are the standing wave structure. The unlabeled center point is the zone of maximum effect. A hand-drawn schematic of exactly the kind of configuration the Wind 2 program built, drawn by a man who lived 2 floors above me for the first 17 years of my life. On the back of the diagram, a date, October 1961, and a signature I looked up the moment I saw it. Yevgeny Astakov, chief physicist of Wind 2. And below the signature, in the format used in the program's geographic index, a set of coordinates. I did not need to look up the coordinates. I have lived at those coordinates. I know the street, the building number. I know which window faced which direction. I know the particular quality of the air in that building, because it is the air I breathed for the first 17 years of my life. And air like that lodges in you the way childhood does, as a baseline, as what ordinary is, as what you measure everything else against without knowing you are measuring. The Wind 2 Geographic Index lists my building as the site of the first calibration survey. October 14th, 1961. 7 hours, 2-kilometer radius. My parents had not yet moved in. I was not born yet, but the configuration Astakov's mathematics has never fully collapsed was established there in 1961, and reinforced 3 more times through 1963, and it was still there, attenuated, below threshold, when my parents arrived, and when I was born, and when I was a child in that building, and when Gennady Ilyitch lived upstairs and watched us from his window with an expression I read as the ordinary affection of an old man for children. He was not a retired meteorologist keeping memories to himself. He was the program's local observer, the person whose job was to stay near the configuration site, monitor subjective anomalies in the population above it, and file reports that I now find in the Wind 2 archive under the heading
Gagarina Street Residential Observations, 1961 to 1969.
He filed reports on my neighbors, on the quality of the air in the building, on whatever the local observer's methodology required him to document about a residential population living above a standing pressure configuration. His reports for the mid-1960s cover the period of my infancy. I have read one of those reports. I could not read more than one. His report from 1966 describes the building's residents in terms I do not have the professional distance to process neutrally. Their daily patterns, their physical presentations, the observations of a trained meteorologist attending to the human material living inside his monitoring zone. He does not describe my family specifically. The report is organized by floor and unit, not by name, but I know which unit on which floor was my family's, and I have been unable to make myself read the entry for that unit. I read the entry on the floor above. I did not read mine. He did not leave the box for safekeeping. He left it as testimony, filed in the only archive still available to him at the end of his life. A neighbor who might, for whatever reason he believed she would, eventually pass it to someone who would know what to do with it. He was wrong about my mother. He was right about me. I have been sitting with this for 3 weeks. A physicist chose to build a technology knowing he should not. A program deployed it over the places where people lived. The configurations persist by the physicist's own mathematics, carrying whatever they have accumulated across decades of standing in the inhabited air. The local observer on my street filed his reports for 8 years, and then retired, and then died, and left his evidence in a box on my mother's shelf. The symptom the calibration surveys documented, the air feels occupied, is the report of people who spent hours beneath a fresh configuration. I spent 17 years beneath one. I have no memory of anything anomalous about the air of my childhood. But I have no way to distinguish between the absence of that feeling and the presence of it so constant, so early, so foundational that it registered not as a feeling, but as the condition for feeling, as what air is, as ordinary, as the baseline against which everything else is measured, without knowing you are measuring, without knowing there is a baseline, because it has always been there, because it was there before you were. I am going to close this file. I am going to return the box to the archive where it should have been 50 years ago. I am going to keep the diagram, a photograph of it, not the original, because a careful person keeps a copy of the evidence that changes how they understand what they have always breathed. The configurations are still there. Astakov wrote it in November 1963 and never went back to his desk. 18 of them, over the Ural corridor, over the cities, over the coordinates in the geographic index, over the apartment where I grew up. I do not know what they are carrying now. I know what was put in them. I know the physicist who put it there asked the same question and did not answer it and stopped working. I went back to that apartment last year. Before I found the file, before I knew any of this, I stood in the room that was my bedroom and breathed, and it was ordinary. I do not know anymore if that is evidence of absence or absence of the capacity to recognize presence. I do not know if I ever did,